Hello, and welcome to the Journal Webinar series of the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, and Soil Science Society of America. I'm Ann Edall with the Journal of Environmental Quality. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Water Quality Trade-offs Between No-Till and Conservation Till Systems. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that questions can be entered in the Q&A section, and the moderator will address them at the end of the presentation. The webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be emailed to all attendees after the session. Now, I am happy to introduce our moderator for today's webinar, Amy Schober, a technical editor for the Journal of Environmental Quality. Dr. Schober is a professor and extension specialist at the University of Delaware in the Department of Plant and Soil Sciences. Dr. Schober's research focuses on nutrient management and environmental quality.
Thank you, Anne. And I'd like to take a moment to thank all the participants for taking the time today to join us. We're excited to continue this monthly webinar series, which features the latest research published in our society journals. As Anne mentioned, please enter any questions in the question and answer section, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Maren McRae. Dr. McRae is a professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Management at the University of Waterloo. She specializes in hydrological controls on biogeochemical processes. She studies water quality at both watershed and field scales, with an emphasis on understanding the impacts of assisted or modified land drainage. Today, Dr. McRae will describe the results of a 4-year study on differences in water quality between no-till and conservation till fields in clay fields at the southwestern end of the Lake Erie Basin in Ontario, Canada. Research showed that there were water quality trade-offs between dissolved and particulate or sediment phosphorus losses. The report was published in the September-October 2023 issue of JEQ, or Journal of Environmental Quality. Dr. McRae, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amy. It's a pleasure to be here. So yes, I'll be speaking today on trade-offs in nutrient and sediment losses and tile drainage in these clays in the southwestern end of the Lake Erie watershed, and a reference to the article is of course posted on screen, as is my contact information if anyone has questions afterwards that would like to reach out to me. So just jumping in, sorry, I'm just moving things from my screen, the joys of online. Okay, so phosphorus losses from agricultural watersheds are contributing to eutrophication in a lot of our freshwater systems. And the Lake Erie, which you can see on the screen, is obviously a key example. Now, we've set ambitious targets for the reduction of those phosphorus loads, and we've certainly promoted the adoption of BMPs, or best management practices. The problem is that there's sometimes uncertainty over what is the best conservation practice in terms of how effective it will be. And there's sometimes unintended consequences where something doesn't work the way you thought it might, or it might actually exacerbate the problem, or sometimes there may be trade-offs between different contaminants. For example, dissolved and particulate phosphorus, or nitrogen and phosphorus. So there's been a lot of discussion regarding runoff and phosphorus pathways. We know that there's a lot of tile drainage in the Lake Erie watershed, and tile drainage can actually represent the biggest flow path for water at the edge of the field, so about 80%. But this isn't necessarily the case for phosphorus. In some areas, especially in our loamier soils with some slope, the small amount of water that you might see lost in the surface runoff can actually be the biggest phosphorus pathway. Even if it's not the dominant pathway, it still packs a lot of punch, and it certainly represents more than the 20% of water loss. But the tiles can still be a pretty big source of phosphorus in some settings. So in the level clays, or the near level clays down at the southwestern end of Lake Erie, tiles are a pretty important pathway for phosphorus. And we can see certainly about 80% of the dissolved phosphorus losses are lost through the tiles. It's a little bit more evenly split for total phosphorus, because still surface runoff, you can have these erosive events that can really generate a lot of particulate in the runoff at times. So why do we actually see a lot of phosphorus losses going out through the tile? Well, a lot of that has to do with preferential drainage or preferential flow paths. So this blue dye staining represents examples of how water, when it soaks into the soil, can actually move preferentially down through the soil, and it can bypass the soil matrix, which means it isn't filtered out as well, and it can go straight into tiles. And so part of the reason for that is stratification at the soil surface when phosphorus is surface applied and not worked in. And part of it, again, is the preferential flow paths. And so although we can certainly see on this picture on the screen that there are times of the year, especially in the springtime when fields are brown, where you can still get a lot of erosion and a lot of sediment transport into the lake. And so to combat this, we've recommended no-till. And so what we're trying to figure out whether or not there are trade-offs in terms of the speciation of nutrients that might actually be leaving through the tile drains in response to this. So one thing that farmers are doing is using cover crops to reduce nutrient losses. And so this is partly by controlling erosion at the surface. So these photographs can show examples of a cover cropped field and a bare field that is obviously not cover cropped. So that really tells you a lot about the soil. So part of it is that they're reducing erosion, but part of it is they can actually catch or take up some of the nutrients from fall applied fertilizers and then release it back to the soils and make it available to the crops the following spring. The problem is that in cold regions, the crops that take up some of this phosphorus, when they freeze and they die, they can re-release that phosphorus in a dissolved phosphorus form. And so that can actually, again, create a trade-off. So given the range of competing processes that are controlling phosphorus and nitrogen losses in tile drainage, we really need more information to characterize potential water quality trade-offs in different management systems and for different soils and different climate settings. And so what we did in this study is we compared seasonal and annual yields and concentrations of different phosphorus and nitrogen species, as well as total suspended solids or total suspended sediments in tile drainage from two systems. And the systems that we compared, one farm used conservation till and incorporated their fertilizers. And so this is our CT, okay? And this is considered conventional for the region. A second farm across just immediately adjacent used no-till with cover crops. So in this case, it's a no-till, had cover crops as well, but he surface broadcast his fertilizer. So both of these farms are under corn, soy, winter wheat rotation. They're both in Brookston clays and they're both systematically tile drained. Which is again very common in the region. And you can see the location of the study is in the Chatham-Merlin area, which is towards the southwestern end of Lake Erie, but obviously on the Canadian side. So just wanted to take a minute to talk about weather. We're in the Great Lakes region, which means anything goes. You can have very dry periods in which crops really are lacking moisture, but at the same time, you can have incredible storm conditions. You can have quite crazy thunderstorms, tornadoes. This is a road. There's cars under here, so you can imagine the types of conditions that we're subjected to. So why am I bringing this up? First of all, it's absolutely a nightmare to collect water quality samples, but more importantly, it poses significant challenges to farmers, because if they have very difficult conditions in the fall through the winter or in the springtime, this can affect their ability. It can affect the establishment of their crops. For example, if they plant winter wheat in the fall, or it can affect their crops in the springtime, their ability to get on their fields. And so there's constant challenges, and they're having to adapt at the last minute. And sometimes they can plan for one crop and have to shift at the last minute to another crop. And that's certainly something that we saw in our study. But again, that's very typical for this region. So this study was conducted over more than 5 years, and we're still collecting data at that field, these farms today, but we pulled 4 full water years for this study. So that would be October to September. And the data were collected year round. We had continuous monitoring in our tile drains, where we used velocity and area sensors. And then we had automated ISCO sensors, which is what you're seeing here. These are water samplers for high frequency event-based sampling throughout events. And this was done year round. Weather data was also collected on site. And so what did we see? Well, one thing that we found is that about 25% of the precipitation that we received was lost in tile drainage. But we actually found that it didn't necessarily differ substantially across our 2 farming systems. So what you're seeing here is the average of the 2 plots on each farm, averaged together to represent our conventional till and our no-till with cover crops. So we saw that most of our runoff was actually happening throughout the non-growing season, and there was very little that actually happened throughout the growing season. What we found is that our dissolved reactive phosphorus was always higher at our no-till site, with the exception of this year, but for the most part, it was consistently higher. And where we really saw a big difference was following the surface application of fall fertilizers, in which we had a lot of incidental losses. So this is where it was particularly prevalent, but even in years where it didn't receive fertilizers, it was still a little bit higher. Now, the opposite is true with our total phosphorus and our TSS, which is our total suspended solids. So we see that the conventional site, our conservation till site, was for the most part greater in TP and TSS in pretty much every year. And the only time where we didn't see this was when we had those massive incidental losses following the fertilizer application. But aside from that, the suspended sediments and TP, which is predominantly particulate phosphorus, were higher at the CT site. Nitrogen, sorry, I just want to go back and mention nitrogen. We didn't really see considerable differences in nitrate. So I'm really emphasizing phosphorus in this webinar today. So we wanted to see if there were differences the differences that we saw cumulatively were consistent across seasons at the sites, or if things changed, for example, when cover crops were on the fields or crops were actively growing versus winter conditions. And so we definitely saw, and so these are concentrations, these are our flow weighted mean concentrations for the different events, and this is flow for the events. So we definitely saw smaller concentrations of nutrients in the summer conditions, but these also corresponded with smaller flow volumes. So we really expected to see higher, we expected to see more flow and higher nutrient concentrations in our tile drainage at the no-till site because of that preferential flow. And maybe we saw a little bit of that, but at the same time, if you think about it in the grand scheme of things, it was very low flow conditions, and we didn't see these really big we didn't see this outside of those conditions. And so in the grand scheme of budgets over the course of the year, we didn't see that big difference. Now, we noticed that we saw TP and TSS concentrations that were higher at our conventional till site, which is what you're seeing in the beige. And we saw that this was pretty consistent across the seasons, and it was most prevalent in the fall conditions. First of all, there was definitely more frequent fertilizer application at this site, but that again had to do with the farmer having to shift crops in response to poor conditions. But the rest of the time, like I said, we didn't really see consistent seasonal differences. So we didn't see a lot of variability across our seasons, but we did see variability across different events. So we can see there's a wide range. Some of this was related to flow conditions where we had higher concentrations with bigger flow events, so a positive relationship. But the relationships between flow and phosphorus concentrations or loads weren't fantastic. And so we found that there were other things at play. So when we looked at flow-weighted mean conditions in response to management activity, some things emerged. We looked at flow-weighted mean conditions. We looked at what I'm looking at in this figure here is we're looking at differences. So we looked at the difference in concentrations between the CT site and the no-till site. And so this is what these represent. And each symbol that you see here represents one of the events. And I've colored it by the size of the event just to see if we see patterns with flow event size, for example. And then the box plots are just showing you the whole population as a box plot. And so if anything is above the 0 line, that means that the CT site was greater for events, and anything below that line means that the no-till cover crop site was greater. And so what we can see for all events, and then we can see events where no fertilizer was applied. If we look at these events, we can see that for the most part, both at times when fertilizer was not applied, which was, most of the events captured, there wasn't recent fertilizer application, we can see that the no-till site had consistently greater dissolved reactive phosphorus concentrations in tile drainage. Although this was not always the case, it was pretty prevalent. The opposite was true for the conservation till site. For the most part, for total phosphorus, for the most part, our total phosphorus was basically almost always greater. This shows us that it's not just around fertilizer application, that these are persistent in time. When we looked at fertilization, this is fertilizer application at both sites, we could see so at this point in time, the fertilizer was applied as a surface broadcast at the no-till site, and it was incorporated at the CT site. And so when the reasonably similar amounts of fertilizer were applied, the incorporation of fertilizer at the CT site meant that we didn't see the same shifts in fertilizer concentration. So we saw tile drain concentrations. So tile drain concentrations were much greater at the no-till site following fertilizer application. And certainly when we only applied at the no-till site, so this is where the no-till site received fertilizer application, but the CT site had not, things were much greater. Now, in this instance, this is a condition where the CT site received fertilizer, but the no-till site did not. And you can see it didn't necessarily have the same effects. It didn't jump at the CT site. So it does show us that with the incorporation of fertilizer, we don't see those very significant incidental losses. But we do see throughout the rest of the year, we do see in response to the tillage, we really do see significant losses of total phosphorus losses. So we also looked at tillage, and we looked at sediment concentrations in tile drainage, and we looked across all events that had not been recently tilled. And so we looked at anything within a 2-3 month period of tillage. And maybe we see a little bit of a difference in the medians, but really it shows us that those differences were kind of persistent throughout the year. So I just want to take a minute to talk about soil phosphorus and its relationship with tile drain phosphorus losses. So I'm showing things in kilograms per hectare here. If you wanted to convert that to pounds per acre, the pounds per acre are about 90% of kilograms per hectare, so pretty close. So both sites have reasonable soil test phosphorus levels. This is Olsen P, which is your bicarb test. And so when we look at these, we can see there's a little bit more stratification at the no-till site, which is what we would expect. So we can see this is throughout the 0 to 15 centimeters. So this is what is typically surveyed. So it's a little bit higher at the no-till site. But both sites OMAFRA would recommend that phosphorus fertilizers should be applied to the fields to meet crop requirements. And if that isn't done, then the farmers would be mining their soils or be in a drawdown phase. So for maintaining that, they would recommend fertilizer applications. But the CT farmer applied more fertilizer simply because he had to shift his crops in response to those poor weather conditions more frequently. And so he applied more fertilizer, but it actually didn't create a difference in his soil test P. So there wasn't so much more applied that it actually led to a difference in fertility. And so when we look at the edge of field losses in the tile drainage, this is the total over the 4-year period at each site. And this is what it translates to the average losses per year. And so what you can see is that they're much high. Okay, so what we can see is that our DRP losses were certainly considerably higher from the no-till cover crop site in our averaged over our 4-year period, but our total phosphorus losses were considerably higher from the CT site. So it's a bit of a trade-off between these. But the other point that I wanted to make was that even at modest soil test phosphorus levels, you can still have significant losses in tile drainage at the edge of the field. And so oftentimes we talk about drawing down our soil P, and I still maintain that drawing down our elevated soil P will make a big difference on losses at the edge of the field. But in areas where they don't have so far to go, you can still have significant losses. So simply lowering fertilizer application amounts and drawing down those soils, that alone is not going to be enough. So just to give you some conclusions, the losses of particulate phosphorus, which are represented in our total phosphorus, these decreased with our no-till cover crop treatment, but our DRP losses increased. And although the farmer had cover crops on the fields, they didn't seem to stop these incidental losses associated with the surface broadcast of DRP in the fall. That being said, tillage increased erosion into the tile drains, and they were greater at our CT site than our no-till cover crop site. So I already mentioned that I think that cover crops and no-till alone are not enough to reduce phosphorus losses in tile drains, certainly because of the potential for incidental losses when the phosphorus is surface applied. And finally, elevated phosphorus losses in tile drainage can still occur from sites without high P soils. And with that, I would like to thank you for listening. And I'd also like to acknowledge my co-authors and our funding agencies. My information is on the screen. And very importantly, I'd like to acknowledge the 2 cooperators who allowed us to work on their farms. They've been absolutely amazing to work with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maren. I have a handful of questions for you to answer. So if you give me 1 second, I'll get those up on the screen for myself. Okay, so our first question comes all the way from Denmark. They wanted to know if the phosphorus was applied in the spring or in the fall, and what is typical of the region.
So it was applied in the fall. And it's it was applied in the fall in this. I think you get a bit of both in the region. You get it sometimes you get it in the fall and sometimes you get it in the spring, but in this particular case, they were applying it in the fall. Although in years where corn, there is some fertilizer application in the spring, like with a side dress, if they're putting the nitrogen on in the spring.
Okay, great, thank you. I had a question about the study design. There were 2 similar questions. One asked, did your study include a no-till with fertilizer applied subsurface or incorporated to compare with the no-till treatment with a broadcast application? Second question was there no 2x2 band of phosphorus applied at the no-till site?
Okay, so no, the study did not include subsurface placement treatment, but actually that's where we would like to go next with this work. So it's definitely something that we're in the stages of getting started on. And no, phosphorus was not applied in a 2x2 band.
Okay, great. Our next question is the release of phosphorus after a cover crop occurring in surface runoff, or does it occur in the phosphorus? Is this phosphorus transported through the tile drainage?
So we didn't see any evidence of okay, so with cover crops in general, one thing that we're finding is that although cover crops can freeze and release phosphorus in winter, we don't find it as prevalent in the modest temperatures that we see in the Great Lakes region. And that's not an output of this study, but it is an output of other studies at nearby sites. So that's one thing, but also, although you may see it, if you're going to see it, I think you're more likely to see it in surface runoff and less likely to see it in tile drainage. So surface runoff, at the time that this study was done, we were not measuring it, although we are now, but there's very, very little surface runoff at these sites.
Okay, another question about the design. What was the phosphorus application rate?
Okay, I don't have that in front of me and I'm embarrassed, but it is in the paper, but I just don't have it in front of me in a table to answer that question. I'm sorry.
We can pass on that one. Okay, so what were the specific reasons for high DRP losses from the no-till treatment? Was it due to high soil test levels or fertilizer application rates, or perhaps is it related to increased hydrological connectivity in the no-till field?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I know, okay, so we saw when we looked at our table just a moment ago, we know that we saw some stratification at the no-till site. So I think stratification is going to be part of it. I also think that there is more preferential drainage into the, I think it's a bit of both, but I also think yeah, I can't say if one is more important than the other at this site. And I know that certainly, like I said, we did see those incidental losses following that fertilizer application. So it kind of makes me wonder if stratification if the preferential connectivity is happening all the time, and if it's more related to the stratification. Yeah, but I can't say. I think it's combination of both.
Okay, along similar lines, there was a question about phosphorus availability in the no-till soils. Do you think it's the same as for availability to crops as the conventionally tilled site?
Availability as in the Olsen P, like the soil test P?
Or how well will the crops be able to take it up? Will there be a difference?
Well, you know, we actually looked at the fertilizer application. So we know that, again, the farmers are in the range that they should be in terms of fertility, where they're not at a deficit, like they're not in a problematic range, like in a depleted range, but they still should be applying fertilizer. We did look at yields between the two farms, and again, that is something that's in the table in the paper, and we did not see any sort of a difference in yields between the two farms. So there doesn't seem to be any issue there with yields.
Great. Were there differences in losses between the conventional till and the no-till with cover crops? Were these differences actually statistically significant is the question.
Some things. So the total phosphorus and total suspended sediments, yes. But
Okay.
Other things had so much variability that when we looked at these things, there was so much variability across events that I think you saw differences during some events, but not all events. So the really clear difference was in the TP and the TSS.
Okay, great. What species of cover crops are being grown in the soil?
He changes that sometimes. I think throughout the different years, I know that sometimes he'll use. I don't know. I don't want to say because I don't want to misspeak, but I know that he has tried different things and he's used species mixes as well. And he's quite innovative with what he does. And he sometimes tries to seed green when he can, but I'm not I don't want to tell you exactly what he put on in case I'm wrong.
Okay. Do you agree that no-till enhances and increases erosion from the surface as the soil surface becomes more resistant to water penetration? I think the question, are you good?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know that I don't know if that's the case everywhere. I think, you know, especially in this case where the farmer is coupling no-till with cover crops, I'm not convinced that would be the case here, but it's definitely a consideration. But I'm not sure that that would be the case here, especially when he's combining it with cover crops.
Okay. Was any manure applied, and what type of tillage implement was used for the conservation tillage?
Okay, so there was no manure that was applied, and it was I think it's just a disc. It's a disc till. I can't tell you the specific equipment that he had, but a conservation till. So it was a shallow till. He went down to maybe 2 inches.
Okay, I've been asked to kind of wrap things up. So a question from a regulatory perspective in Canada. In either case, are either TPP flows or dissolved reactive P close to a violative level for your region?
The losses, you mean?
Yes.
I don't know. That's a great question. I mean, these are high. I don't know. I know we would like to see them lower than they are. Let's put it that way. The ones that we saw in this study, they are higher than we would like to see. Let's put it that way. But I don't know if they are. Have they reached the threshold that I was asked about?
Okay, and one last question. Do you think that the DRP results would be different for the no-till site if you used a 2x2 phosphorus placement, and how are you planning to proceed?
Yes, and we are. Yes, I do. I absolutely do. I guess I mean, certainly, I really think you're going to limit those incidental losses. I think you know we still have to see about stratification and how quickly that would change, and if there would still be stratification without incorporation. But I certainly think it would make a difference on those incidental losses, and I think it would allow you to have the benefits of the no-till in terms of the TP, as well as suppressing those DRP losses. So I think it would go a long way. And so we're working with the farmer now to see if we can implement this treatment on one of the 2 plots on his field. So we're actually working on that, and I've been in conversations with him right now, and we have some funding. We're working with Fertilizer Canada on some of this, and CERC. We have a project that's ongoing right now that we're looking at this very question.
Okay, I think we'll wrap up the questions with that. And I want to thank you again for joining us for today's webinar. And thank you, Dr. McRae, for sharing your research. As a reminder, the recording will be made available and sent to all attendees in the near future. And I want to thank you again and have a good day.